Coming Back is a 100% listener-supported podcast. To support the show and to get your hands on some really cool podcast swag, head on over to patreon.com/ShelbyForsythia. Support the show for as little as $1 per month and change or cancel your support at any time. Your support keeps Coming Back ad-free, which is really awesome. Thank you. Hi there, and welcome to Coming Back, a podcast about coming back to life after loss. On today's show, I'm talking to psychotherapist, author, designer, and fellow podcaster Kimberly Wilson, who one of our grief growers requested come on Coming Back. We're talking about the loss of her grandma and the loss of her beloved pug dog Louie, and how she finds tranquility in the midst of grief. Also on the show today, I'm taking a cue from my conversation with Kimberly and diving into the unique relationships we have with our pets and why it hurts so much when we lose them. I'm Shelby Forsythia, an intuitive grief guide who speaks, writes, and teaches the transformational power of grief and loss. My mom's death in 2013 set me on the path to becoming a lifelong student of grief, and I use what I learned to equip others with the knowledge to heal and remind them that they are not alone. Because even through grief, we are growing. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coming Back. Thank you for tuning in and for joining me today. I'm talking to you today just having seen the blue moon, blood moon, supermoon, lunar eclipse out my window here in Chicago. And before I start the top of the show today, I want to just really quickly note how calming and comforting it is to watch astronomical events when you're grieving. Meteor showers are probably my personal favorite. There's actually one every single year on my birthday. But moon and sun events are also really grounding and a big reminder that humans have been doing this life thing for thousands of years. We've been around for thousands of years. It's kind of like that being so small in the face of the ocean feeling, which is just really nice to capture sometimes when your heart's feeling lonely. So later on today's show, I'm talking to Kimberly Wilson, who lost her grandmother, but she tells us in her interview that a few years later, she had two other losses that hit her really hard, losing her all-black cat and losing her well-known pug, Louie. You will hear her mention that she's still really grieving and missing Mr. Louie, which became kind of a key highlight of our conversation. So I wanted to talk about pet loss today. What about it makes it different than human loss? Why it's so hard when we lose our pets, and what we can do to continue to remember them after they've died. So in doing some research and from personal experience and from talking to all of you in the Grief Growers Garden, I kind of gathered that society holds these beliefs about our relationships with animals. Unfortunately, common responses to a pet dying are things like, "Oh, don't feel bad. It was only a blank," insert species of pet here. Or, "Oh, it's okay. You can get another one." Or, "I don't understand. You must be one of those crazy dog/cat/horse/bird/fish/hamster people." And lastly, of course, the dreaded, "Time heals all." These are really hurtful comments and ones that don't help hearts who have just lost a beloved pet. When we zoom out a little bit, we can see that there's stylized versions of 4 of the 6 grief myths, which I talk about in episode 5 of Coming Back. Don't feel bad, replace the loss, grieve alone or other isolating statements such as "you must be crazy," and "time heals all." But on top of the fact that these are societal grief myths, they also imply something deeper about pet loss explicitly that's not always implied in human loss. There's this notion that the lives of pets have less value than the lives of humans. There's another notion that every pet is interchangeable, that relationships with our pets are not unique or special. And of course, there's a third notion that quote-unquote too much grief on your part is weird or other or permissible to make fun of or cast out from the norm. And just like with so many other things that are related to grief, society tells us that our love for our pets should be at kind of an arm's length kind of love. And pets are different than humans. They are. But for a lot of us, that's what we actually like about them. Pets are nonverbal for the most part. They communicate with us in ways other than talking, which brings us out of our heads, where we come from a lot of human relationships, and into our bodies. So things like going for walks, being able to pet them or ride them become the ways that we communicate with them, that we speak to them. And there's a type of connection there that we can't always have with the humans in our lives. Pets are also sources of unconditional love. They don't operate on the same moral or judgment level as we do, which is really refreshing. They're not clouded by this judgment of good or bad, or right or wrong, or Democrat or Republican. Some people find it so much easier to love a dog than to love their dad or their mom or their siblings or their grandparents or their coworkers, because this weight of judgment or this weight of conditional love just doesn't exist in a pet relationship. They're always happy to see you. They're always happy you're home. They're happy to be anywhere with you. They just want to be near you and spend time with you. And kind of the last big way that pets are different than humans is that they operate on instinct, not on societal norms. This is kind of similar to the unconditional love, no judgment thing, but I'm really meaning being themselves here. A pet's default setting is themselves. They don't put up walls to make you like them or make them seem like anything different than what they already are. They don't mask their habits or their personality, their lack of potty training, their appearance, their likes, their dislikes in order to please you or anybody else. Unlike humans, pets are 100% of the time just unashamedly themselves. So why is it so hard to lose them? I want to get into why pets in particular are hard to lose. So first, let's remember the definition of grief that's brought to us from the grief recovery method, which is grief is the collection of conflicting emotions brought on by the end of or change in a normal pattern of behavior. Pets are with us every single day. They are a part of our routines and regular everyday things like feeding them, taking them out, playing with them, and sleeping with them are what normal looks like for us. So it's really jarring when that routine and that normalcy is upset. And all of a sudden, there's no one to feed. There's no one to take out. There's no one to play with. And there's no one sleeping beside you at night. A lot of articles I read on this, people noted that they spend more time with their pets than their coworkers or their siblings or their roommates or their spouses. It's no wonder that it's incredibly hard and you grieve when a pet dies. They're your everyday. In the same vein, second thing, pets are super dependent. They need us in order to live. They need us to do all the feeding and cleaning and exercising and caretaking on their behalf. Because of that responsibility and dedication and devotion, pets have a tendency to make us better people. Their dependency on us gives us something outside of ourselves to care for. And so when they die, not only do those everyday tasks stop, but that feeling of doing for something outside of ourselves can fade too. And that's really hard. That's a part of how we see ourselves. So many people frame themselves as their pet's parent, a dog mom or a cat dad or, a bird parent, things like that. And when a pet dies, it's really easy to slip into this feeling of, well, now nothing I love is dependent on me. Who or what am I living for? Third thing is that we develop unique and special relationships with each of our pets. Just like different pieces of ourselves are brought out in different relationships and environments, different pieces of ourselves are brought out in different pets. So when I go home to North Carolina and take care of my 17-year-old cat, Cookie, I pet him softly. I take time to mash up and blend up food and medications for him. I laugh at how much he sleeps, and I move myself out of the way when he tries to get to the kitchen heater to sleep. Conversely, my Chicago cat, Mr. 5-year-old Gigi, who many of you have seen on my Instagram, he and I sleep and nap together. I'll play with his toes and kiss his belly when we're sleeping on the couch. I have trained him to hold still for nail clippings and to get off the counter when I snap my fingers. I always lay on the bed when I come home from a long trip so we can rebond and cuddle again. He and I are much more silly and much more kind of hands-on than I am with Cookie. And part of that has to do with age, but part of it is it's just a different relationship and a different personality with each animal. I know if I tried to nap with Cookie, he'd just get up and find another patch of sun that was away from me. And it's not a personal thing. He doesn't hate me because pets don't operate that way. It's just what he prefers. And Gigi, on the other hand, is so much of a leech. He literally will rest his paws on top of my face when we sleep, like he's claiming a part of me. I posted in the Grief Growers Garden about the relationships we have with our pets, and Stephanie Zamora, who we heard from on Coming Back as a guest on episode 8, said that of all of her pets, she feels like she has a very strong tie to her cat Max, who she feels she knew and was bonded to in a past life. I've heard of other people having soulmate connections the instant they see their furry babies for the first time at a shelter or a store. Guys, we have these beliefs and these depths of relationships that are very, very real to us with pets. Fourth reason why it's really hard to lose a pet, especially if they're older, if they've lived a long time, our pets have seen us through a lot of shit. They see us at our best and at our worst, when we get terrible news and when we're dancing around in excitement. They sit with us and they stay with us through our other griefs and losses, so death, divorce, diagnosis, etc. And they don't question our grief or behavior. They just continue to love us through it. And sometimes they're getting older, their aging coincides with big milestones in our lives. One article that I read was from a quote-unquote recovery cat who a woman took in right when she started getting sober from drugs. And each year this cat, Callie, lived. Each year that she went on, she represented another year that this woman was clean. And another woman wrote how heartbreaking it was that her terminally ill cat would not get to see her reach a big milestone in her and her husband's life, which was bringing a new baby into the house. So these animals, they mark these milestones with us. Fifth reason why it's hard to lose a pet is that we don't use death language with them. And this is kind of a sneaky one. We don't use death language for pets. We use this softer, more clinical language like put down or put to sleep or even euthanize. We don't use that language with people, and it makes it really hard to assign the weight and the permanence of death of a pet when the language for their death is so removed. It's so distant. It's kind of It's softer. It's not as hands-on. It doesn't seem as harsh. Often, pets' deaths too are within our control, and that's hard too. There's these complicated emotions like guilt and regret for things we could have done, sadness, relief, heartache wrapped up in our pets' deaths, and soft language doesn't really help us or others see the severity of these deaths very clearly. And last, probably the biggest reason that it's so hard to lose a pet is going back to what I said earlier. Society just doesn't acknowledge it the same way that it acknowledges other deaths. There's rarely an instance where you can take off work or take off school for the death of a pet. Funeral homes and other organizations don't always acknowledge the need to bury or cremate pets who have passed on. Friends and family tend to gloss over your unique relationship with your pet by asking when you're going to get another one, or telling you to get over it because it's a dog. It's not like you lost a human in your life. There's just this big stigma and silence surrounding pet loss that encourages pet owners to hurry up and get over it, get a new dog already, and not speak up about the inevitable heartbreak of losing this pet, of losing this relationship. So how can we honor our pets who have died, our furry and feathery and scaly family members? First way, of course, always is to talk about them. When a pet dies, let people know. Don't keep that to yourself. Some of the sweetest articles I read included stories of friends and family coming together for a night of sharing stories and pictures and videos of a pet who died. Think of it kind of as a heavenly going away party. And it doesn't have to be a big gathering, maybe even you and a close friend, but making that connection with others who appreciate and love your pet is huge. And if you can't do something in person, share your story with people online who are willing to hold space and listen. We've shared lots of stories of pet loss many times in my private Facebook group, The Grief Growers Garden, if you'd like to join. We would love to hold space for your story and for your pet as well. Second is to join a group, to bond with other grieving pet owners, and this kind of goes a step beyond just sharing the news to actually connecting over this grief. Two organizations that I found on a quick search are, of course, the Grief Recovery Method, which has a special subset of grief recovery method courses for pet loss, and the Association for Pet Loss and Bereavement, or APLB, and they actually have online chat rooms where you can share stories and ask questions in addition to their in-person support groups. And I will link to both of these, the Grief Recovery Method and the Association for Pet Loss and Bereavement, in the show notes. Lastly, ritualize and memorialize their death. You'll hear this later from Kimberly Wilson, how she's memorialized her pets through the years. But you can do all kinds of things to allow your pets to continue to take up space in your life and in your heart. So things like getting jewelry or a rock for your garden made, having your pet cremated and then keeping or scattering ashes somewhere they loved, donating to a rescue organization or another charity on a regular basis that supports causes your pet might appreciate, a yearly birthday celebration with their favorite foods, keeping photos of them on social media and around your house, having a t-shirt made with their face on it. Literally, however you want to carry them forward into your life is up to you. Pets are not humans, and that makes things hard when we're grieving. It seems like there are a lot less people to relate to. Grief growers, there will be people who just don't understand. It's the case with all grief, but with pet loss in particular, there will just be people who don't understand. Immediately after the loss of your pet, don't try to make these your people, no matter how close they are to you. It's not your job in that moment to convert people who don't get what it's like to lose a pet, while you need that comforting and that understanding and that space made for you. Find the people who get it first. Seek those people out first, and then you can start to open that conversation up with others once you're feeling a little bit more supported, a little more stabilized, and a little bit less alone in your loss. If you are grieving a pet, I am so sorry. If I'm the first person you're hearing from saying I'm sorry in regards to your beloved pet, I am sorry about that too. That's garbage. Your pet was an important part of your life and deserves to be remembered and treasured and loved for the rest of your life. I am so glad that you had the relationship with them that you did. It's so powerful, and it's so fun. It's so amazing and such a gift to have a relationship with an animal in your life. If you've lost a pet or have something to say about grieving after a pet dies, I would absolutely love if you join me for Facebook Live this Monday, February 5th at 1 o'clock Central Time. All you have to do is like my Facebook page, which is Shelby Forsythia Intuitive Grief Guide, to be notified when the broadcast begins. Next up, we'll talk to Kimberly Wilson about the loss of her grandmother, her cat, and her pug, Louie, and how she managed to work the idea of tranquility into her grief. Kimberly Wilson is a psychotherapist in private practice, the author of 5 books, and the designer of eco-fashion Tranquility. She founded Tranquil Space in 1999, named among the top 25 yoga studios in the world by Travel and Leisure, and hosts the podcast and blog Tranquility du Jour. Her work has been featured in The Washington Post, Fast Company, U.S. News and World Report, Bella Grace, and more. Kimberly lives in Washington, D.C. with rescue pets and a partner. She dreams of Paris and starting a micro-sanctuary for pigs and pugs. I know that we've been wanting to have you on the show since one of the grief growers in the Grief Growers Garden actually requested that you come on. So I'm so excited that you said yes and that you're here to share your loss story with us. So let's jump in with your losses.
Yeah. So, thank you, by the way, for reaching out. This is such an important topic to me. And it's something that every time I've had a pretty intense loss, it's contributed to a pretty big change. So, in 2012, I lost my beloved grandmother. She was 99 and a half, and I know people will be like, oh, it's a nice long life. And I'm like, no, it was not long enough. And she was in hospice care in Texas. And I had gone down that weekend to be with her, not expecting it to be the end by any means. She was still trucking along despite having been in hospice for, like 6 weeks at that point. And we were not expecting this to be the end. And whenever I got there, things took a turn. And so I ended up staying with her throughout that weekend and beyond, and then was with her as she passed. And that really kind of shook me to the core. My grandmother was one of my absolute favorite beings from childhood. I remember I would play in her garden up at the lake in Oklahoma, this beautiful home that she'd built into a hill. And she had this huge garden, and we would catch grasshoppers and butterflies and plant flowers. And so she has been a part of my life for many, many years, and really, truly like one of my heroes. So losing her was a pretty challenging experience. And surprisingly so, because of course we knew the end was coming. She was 99 and a half, but still was not prepared for it. And so actually after that loss, I decided probably about a month later, maybe about 3 months later. And then I announced it. And then a month after that, so in May, I went on a semi-sabbatical. So basically at that point, I had been eating, sleeping, breathing a yoga studio, 2 yoga studios that I had founded, and was also in graduate school, and just knew I needed to kind of step back. It was one of those experiences with grief when you can just tell that, I describe it as being encased in concrete.
Ooh,
like it's just,
I love that visual.
Yeah. I mean, because it's like it's almost impossible to just get by with the day to day, and so that was a big change for me. And I actually never returned from the 1-year semi sabbatical, and I continued to be pulled away from the day to day operations of the studio as much as a founder can, who's pretty obsessed with details. So I did hand over a lot of management and bill pay and things along those lines. So that was my kind of first take with it, and it was incredibly jarring.
Thank you so much for sharing that story and for telling us kind of that visual of being encased in concrete. I love people's metaphors and visuals for grief. When did you know? Like when was kind of the point where you were like, okay, I need to drop everything. This is the point. This is enough. Or I need to start doing something different.
Yeah, I'd say pretty shortly after. So my grandmother passed in February, and I went on semi-sabbatical in May. And so I would say it was probably around April that I made the announcement. And, it was a pretty big deal for having kind of managed and overseen a team for 15 years and, always kind of at the studio and what have you. So to take the step back was a pretty big piece of my kind of life trajectory, and the fact that I just realized I couldn't do it all. And at that point, I didn't want to do it all anymore. It's like I needed the space and the time, which is something I'd never really had as a creative entrepreneur, to fully immerse kind of in the grief process and to just create more space for myself. So I'd say within a month, I knew that something had to shift.
And what was the sabbatical made of?
Well, the idea was the semi-sabbatical was I was still going to be teaching at the studio. I just was not going to be managing or paying bills or there all the time. So I was still going to be going to graduate school, doing a, part-time internship and managing a clothing line and, all the other things I had. But from the studio perspective, I just wasn't going to be there every day.
And you speak a bit on the need for creating space and creating time, which I know as a fellow entrepreneur is like almost impossible, because when you are in a business, especially a heart-centered business, like it sounds like you have a lot of heart-centered businesses, it's hard to step away from that because you literally wake up in the morning and you go to sleep at night thinking about your business, thinking about your creations, thinking about your work. And I guess in the midst of that space and time, like where did you go? What did you do? What came up for you in all of that? Because when we make space and time for grief, I hear sometimes it can often surprise us with what comes up in the meantime.
Yeah, well, what was interesting, what came up in the meantime with that is I never returned from the semi-sabbatical, right? So I kept at that level of involvement even after the May 15th deadline of returning had passed. And I'm like, hey, no one remembers that I said 1 year and it happened on May 15th. And then I was like, you know what? I don't think I want to return to doing that anymore. And so during that process, it was really interesting that it was the ability to step away and actually begin to become okay with it. And that allowed me also to put more energy into kind of the letting go process and recognition that she wasn't with us anymore, and how life was going to be different, how I wanted it to be different, and what have you. So that loss in particular, I think, had a pretty profound effect on me, in the fact that it contributed to some pretty big life changes.
Yeah, in the sense that you never kind of went back to that same level of energetic output.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
You say that you took this time to really focus on the process of letting go. And what does that look like for you? Or what did that start to look like for you? Because a lot of people, when they approach grief, they're like, I don't even know what letting go is supposed to look like. And you kind of have to create rituals or even recognition in your own mind that, wow, okay, I think I'm letting go of this. That's what this looks like for me.
I did a lot of things around, I'm a big kind of writer, journal writer. She was a big diary keeper.
I love that.
Yeah, so she kind of planted those seeds, right? So I did a lot of writing. I think writing is incredibly healing. I also, it was interesting. We kept some pieces of her clothing. She lived in an assisted living center at that point. So her closet was tiny and there were just a few things. And I kept, like some embroidery thread, a little like sewing, this cute little like cross-stitched sewing pad where you put your needles. So, I had things like that on display. I would wear the sweater that she had worn all the time because she was always cold, even when it was 100 degrees in Texas. And, so I kept that. So I would wear things. I had things that she had made or jewelry or, little trinkets. I had those around. And it was this way. And then, of course, I did a lot of writing. And so it was this way to really begin to come to terms with it. I also saw a hospice grief counselor for a couple of months, maybe 2 or 3 until she moved. And that was so, so helpful. I highly recommend that. I found that to be incredibly helpful, particularly somebody who deals with grief and loss. And, there's so much grief and loss, right? From losing a job to a beloved pet, which happened to me in 2015, which I still have not recovered from, to, losing a relationship, to losing a city that you loved and you've had to move on or transition. So, loss is something that we're constantly dealing with. And so the more that we're able to work with that, I think it really helps us to keep going because it's such a consistent part of who we are.
To engage with it helps us keep going with it. You mentioned another loss of yours in 2015 of a pet.
Yes.
Can you tell us that story as well?
Yeah, so 2015, it was interesting. It was right before, it's maybe like December of 2014, like a beloved black pug who totally obsessed with. He was 10 years old. Yeah, he was like, truly, when I say like I've had a partner for 14 years, I'm like, meanwhile, this dog was the love of my life, right? So obsessed. His name was Louis the Pug. And, a lot of my like podcast listeners knew him because he was always snoring through interviews or people had met him on retreats or, so he was he was a well-loved pug. And it was in the fall, late 2014, we just noticed he had some sinus things going on, which is not odd at all for a pug. And so we took him in and, he had, the sinus infection pills, whatever. And it seemed to kind of be clearing it up, but not fully. And then in January, he had a seizure. I thought I was going to lose it. I mean, it was so scary. And if you've ever been around a pet or a person, having a seizure, it's so, so traumatic. And then he woke up from it. He was disoriented, but he seemed fine. So it was this really weird experience. So anyway, we get him in to see a neurologist. And, long story short, before I know it, he's diagnosed with brain cancer. And he has this large tumor growing behind his nasal passage, which is odd because it's more commonly found with dogs that have a snout. And he clearly did. He had none, right? He was just flat-faced as a pug. So that was really traumatic. And so, we really didn't have options because you can't operate in that area. And then also chemotherapy was an option, but it would only extend his life a couple of months. And we were we wouldn't even do that to ourselves. So, we kept doing all we could to keep him as comfortable as possible. And also told ourselves quality of life was critical. So we would never keep him around just for ourselves. We knew that we needed to do what was right for him. So he's diagnosed late January and then we lost him mid-April. And it's even hard to talk about. It's still so traumatic. And it's been, my God, it's been almost 3 years now, but I don't know. I mean, I really don't know if I'll ever get over that. And it's interesting, I read too, someone, because of course I did a lot of reading after the loss of him in particular, around the loss of pets. And I was like, why is it so traumatic to lose a pet? And, one of the articles I came across was like why it was harder to lose my dog than my mom. And it was interesting. And the woman was talking about the fact that, with people, we have stuff, right? There's always stuff. There's like someplace they've disappointed us, someplace they've let us down, vice versa. There's been some conflict, whereas a dog, it's like, yeah, they can misbehave, but there's like this unconditional regard. And I thought that article did a great way of explaining why pet loss is like truly so, so traumatic. And, to get me through that, I actually, within a couple weeks, I stopped teaching yoga. And I had been teaching yoga nonstop for, at that point, probably 16 years.
Wow.
And I was just like, I can't go in and tell people to inhale and exhale because I don't care right now. It's like I am just like not in a place where I want to be showing up and doing this. And I can't, like I physically just can't. And so yeah, I stopped teaching yoga regularly then, and I never returned to a regular yoga class after that. And that's, despite owning 2 studios, teaching a lot since 1999 when I started teaching. And it just like, it really just brought me to my knees.
I'm so sorry for both of these losses. And this one sounds like he's especially lodged in your heart. And I love that for you, but at the same time, it's so heartbreaking. I'm kind of drawing this parallel between the loss of your grandmother and the loss of your dog, in that she died in hospice care, and then with him, you kind of became his hospice experience. There's not really, to my knowledge, there's not like a hospice for pets or dogs or cats when we go to lose them, but this attention and this detail to the quality of his life and keeping him out of pain and things like that, I don't know, I'm getting this energetic sense that maybe your experience from the loss of your grandmother informed the loss with him.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I think too, just a heads up, there actually is hospice for dogs, and pets, if you can believe it. And we actually kind of had that, to a degree, because we had a natural, I forget the name for it, but it's like a natural vet. So it's a vet who has gone through all the MD training, but then also does this other piece, which is like acupuncture and herbs and all of that. And we didn't find the herbs to be helpful. We did some acupuncture with him, but she also was able to come to the house to put him down, which is like the worst phrase ever, but which was really good because we didn't want to take him to this like sterile environment of the vet, which is lovely, and they had been so great, but to be able to have him here was really, really important. And yes, definitely it did inform. And I forgot to mention in 2013, I lost my firstborn cat, and similar experience where I also brought this woman in. He had cancer, so that happened in 2013, and that was quite traumatic. It wasn't the degree with Louis, but he was like my firstborn, and like I was obsessed with this like really mean, nasty black cat, and I'd had him for like 14 years, right? So we were quite connected, and that was pretty traumatic. And then a dog in 2015. So I'm like, why did I miss the cat one? I totally skipped that as I was telling you all this, and yeah, it was cancer too. So it's just like loss after loss. I will say it helps to inform how painful it is, and to know like, okay, this is what to expect. Like, this is not easy. And one thing that I read at some point in this book called In Lieu of Flowers, I think, is that each loss you have, it builds on the other. And so that's why the more losses you have, kind of the more intense it becomes. And I don't know if that's true or not, but that's kind of stuck with me as to why, particularly Louis 3 years ago may have been so, so hard.
That's a great point to make, and it's something that I've read in my work as well. It's the idea of grief being cumulative, like it builds on itself over time, the more losses that you have, especially if those griefs, if those relationships go unaddressed. So if you didn't see a hospice counselor, or if you didn't put the energy into writing, to reading, to taking that time for yourself and giving that time and space to yourself to really process these losses, there's also another school of thought that kind of can run alongside this idea of grief being cumulative, and that is each loss has two ingredients, and that's time and intensity. So we can grieve a lot for someone we've known for our whole lifetime, and it really just blows our world open. But we can also grieve for somebody we knew and loved very, very intensely, that we felt very, very connected to, even if we only felt connected to them for maybe a year or 2 years, and or even shorter than that, like 6 months. And it's interesting how society like grades, quote unquote, these levels of losses. So for some reason, if you don't know somebody for a very long time, it seems less valid than if you knew them for your entire lifetime, or if they're not capable of, quote unquote, speaking, like pets and things like that are. There's like this less validation that comes from society of, oh, they were just a dog. And you're just like, no, but this level of intensity, that this being lodged in my heart feeling that I have for these babies, this is not comparable. No relationships are comparable to each other. So yeah, I think you're really onto something there.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, this idea of it being cumulative, because I don't know, you're just like, oh, well, can't I get through one and like be done with it and then be fresh for the next one?
That's what the movies tell you.
Yeah, exactly. Hollywood makes it look like that. No, I mean, it just, it's surprising, I think, of the depth, the level of the intensity that happens with loss. Yeah.
I'm really interested to shift now into the work that you do, because your overarching theme is tranquility. And when I think of tranquility, I think of like peaceful ponds and Zen gardens and being lost in the forest and like the snow falling and having no one around. And I'm interested to how you got to this place in this space, or I imagine you created it before these losses happened, but maybe how you've managed to maintain, redefine, share the message of tranquility through these losses and through your life.
Yeah, it's funny, with tranquility and the images that you just mentioned, because you're right. I mean, that's, I think, what people have in mind whenever there's this, when you see the word tranquil. And to me, I've always kind of been like, how can we find this sense of tranquility within our everyday, meaning within, the sirens and the lost keys and the, overflowing laundry basket, whatever it is, it's how to be able to actually bring a little bit of that into our everyday life. And if you think about it too, with regard to the grief process, I think of it as like this sense of softness, bringing in the sense of kind of compassion into a really, really challenging situation.
How can we bring like small chunks of tranquility into our grief?
The biggest thing that I recommend for people is to take really good care of yourself. I mean, which sounds trite and cliche, but it's so critically important. So for example, I found that during these losses, I needed to sleep a lot, right? So I mentioned earlier feeling encased in concrete. So I needed to sleep a lot, and I needed to rest a lot more than usual. So my energy, say if it was typically at like 90%, it went to probably about a 40. So I had to keep that in mind with regard to what I committed to, what I took on, what I said yes to, what I let go of, etc. And I think that is one of the biggest things that is so very important. Also to do little things to help memorialize it. And what I mean by that is, so with Louis, when we lost him, we went the next day to pick up his ashes, and then we went straight to a Home Depot to get flowers and, in colors that he liked. Not that we knew he liked him, but we thought he liked him.
Sure.
And then, sure. And, with monkey grass, which was his favorite, to play in. And, so we went and we got all this stuff, and we ordered on Etsy this stone that said Louis and a paw print. And we got him this beautiful urn, so doing things like that. And with my grandmother, I got a small urn too to have some of her ashes. The rest were buried, but I was able to take some. And then also with Bonard, the kitty, I've got his ashes. So like my mantle is like full of ashes, right? It's like got 3 different urns for my 3 loved ones and that I've lost. And so that, I think has been a really important way for me, to be able to keep this connection alive and keep them as part of me while also knowing that they're no longer with me physically. And then also, as I mentioned, the wearing of my grandmother's clothes, which may sound a little odd, but I found that very comforting. Again, it was like this sweet little cardigan, and it was just, I don't know, it smelled like her, so things like that I think are really important. I did tons of reading about grief. And I also talked, with other people who had lost family members or pets. And that was helpful. But I will say the one thing that is not helpful that I think everyone should keep in mind is oh, I remember how hard it was when I lost my grandma. Or, oh, I remember how hard it was when I lost little Nookie, their dog. And I just remember I would get a lot of those sort of cards or comments, and it was so jarring because while I get that it feels like this is relatable, that's not helpful to someone who is grieving at all. They don't care about your story unless they're asking for it. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's something that's called a concept that's called intellectually true, emotionally not helpful. And it's this whole well, if we had the same experience, it should be relatable. But emotionally, it's absolutely not helpful at all. And at the worst, it's kind of insulting or offensive.
It is. I remember I would get cards like that and I would toss them. I wouldn't even fully read them. And I
would too. I'd set them on fire for all I care.
I mean, it's crazy. I don't know why I felt so offended by that. And yet it was so thoughtful, right? That someone would reach out and send something, but yet they're sending me their grief. And that was just quite jarring. So that's, I think, one thing, if we could all keep that in mind, that it's really important to let people have their story, their grief. And if you're acknowledging it, to acknowledge it and not how you too have suffered.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That listening first and then connecting, if invited, second.
Right. Absolutely.
How do you take your experience with grief and loss into your business, into your offerings now, whether that's continuing to do yoga or your podcast or the books that you've written? How do you connect yourself with other grieving hearts that you find through your work?
What's really interesting is I have quite a few clients who have lost parents, and it's not at all that they all knew that I worked with people who dealt with loss. It's just somehow they have found me. And I find that to be such an honor and a gift to be able to work with people who have lost family members, because I can empathize with the challenge around it. And I also definitely want to be able to work with people who have also lost, pets. That's an area where I would like to also help specialize. And I'm studying veterinary social work on the side. And so that's another way where I think that will be helpful. But I definitely bring this into my work, and I bring it in the fact of, giving resources. So I've got a few books that I always recommend, or I'll send to friends or, loved ones whenever they have lost a family member or a pet. That tends to be, being able to share these resources and also to hold a space for them from someone who really gets it. I think it would be hard to fully do that if you've just studied loss and grief. I mean, I think that would be so powerful, right? Because you've got all the theory, but to have the practice of actually having been through some pretty significant losses is also, and studied it, I think is also incredibly, incredibly therapeutic for clients, for friends, and for writing.
What are some of the resources that you hand out?
I have a favorite book, and I realized, I was like, oh, I wish I had it in front of me. And it's actually at the office because I use it so much with clients. But what it's called, it's so good, is Grieving Mindfully.
Ooh, I'm writing that one down.
Since I don't have it in front of me, what I did is I pulled up a blog post that I wrote in 2012, a couple months after I lost Grandma, and I have a bunch of quotes from it that I found particularly helpful. So if you'd like, I'd be happy to read some of these.
Yes, if you could pick a favorite, that would be awesome.
Let's see. I mean, there's so many. I think I wrote like 15 in this. So to pick a favorite might be tricky. Okay, this is interesting. Although grief stems from the loss of a relationship in some form, it can also be the beginning of a much larger journey, a journey into the very meaning of your life. Okay, no big deal, right? I mean, that's huge.
It's massive.
This is really interesting too. In this loss, your identity becomes unstable. You feel an eerie sense of life going on, yet being radically different. I mean, that is like, oh my God, this book is amazing. And it's thin, so people can read it quickly. There's also some exercises in it, and it's written by a therapist from Florida. So I can't recommend this book more highly.
The losses that you've experienced have put you in a place where you've been able to create more meaning in your life. It sounds like your life was very meaningful already, but especially with the loss of your grandmother, to be able to step back and say, how much work, how much energy do I really need to be focusing into these places? How much can I take for myself? And then with your cat, and then with Mr. Louis, it's this whole process of how can I keep remembering? How can I create rituals and honor and memorialize and continue relationships even if they're physically no longer with me. And so it sounds like you have used this concept of inserting these chunks of tranquility into your life to create these pockets just of acknowledgement that they're still here.
Yes.
I love it. Excellent. Well, as we're coming to the end of our interview time today, I would absolutely love to let my listeners know where they can find you, how they can work with you, and if you've got anything else coming up that we should all know about.
Absolutely. I'd love to connect with your listeners, and I can be found at kimberlywilson.com. So very easy. And, I lead retreats. I offer mentoring. I offer therapy for those of you in the DC area. And, I have some books out there on how to find tranquility in everyday life, and a podcast on it's called Tranquility du jour. So again, I think I'm French. I'm so not French. I'm actually German and English. So I have all these like random French things, and I'm like, my boyfriend's always like, you are not French. I'm more French than you are. He did Ancestry.com, right? And I'm like, that's so not fair. But yeah, so I've got Tranquility du jour, and it's this idea, right, of how do we interject tranquility into our everyday, even when we're dealing with loss, with disappointments, and, just there's so much. And, last year, having sold my yoga studios, that was a really interesting piece about loss too, right, of letting go of something you have birthed and nurtured for 18 years. One book that I recommend from that process is called Transitions: Making Sense of Life's Changes. That's a really good book too, because sometimes it is loss, right? It can be death, or it can be, the death of not actually a breathing being, a sentient being. It could actually be the death of, a business, something that you have to let go of, you decided to let go of. And so that, I think, is just a really important thing to keep in mind, and that I try to share my experience through the work that I do and offer.
Well, thank you so much, Kimberly, for coming on the show today. I'm so glad that one of our grief growers asked that I reach out to you, because I think within this show, there's been so much validation for losses that you've experienced over the long term. It doesn't matter that she lived a good life, quote unquote. I wanted more of that. And also for all of our grief growers out there who I know are listening, who have lost pets in the last couple years or so and in their lifetime. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Shelby. I really appreciate it.
So that's all for this episode of Coming Back. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to Kimberly Wilson, who one of our grief growers requested be on the show. Kimberly came back by taking a sabbatical from her work, seeing a hospice grief counselor, writing, reading, and finding tangible ways to memorialize her loved ones in her day-to-day life. You can find a link to Kimberly's work, as well as 2 articles she wrote on the grief of losing Louis the Pug, in today's show notes. Join me for Facebook Live this Monday, February 5th at 1 o'clock Central Time. We'll be talking all about pet loss, how pets are different than people, why it's so hard to lose them, and how we can keep their memories alive after they've gone. We have some new Patreon supporters to honor this week. Shout out to Nara, a wonderfully active member of the Grief Growers Garden, for pledging to support Coming Back on Patreon. Thank you so much for keeping the podcast going. As a reminder, Patreon is a set-it-and-forget-it way to support the show each month and to get rewarded for doing it. You can find a link to my Patreon page in the show notes if you'd like to support, just like Nara. Another way to support the show is to subscribe and tell a friend about Coming Back, because you never know what someone you love is going through. Thank you always to Mr. Addy Goldstein, who composed our theme music. And as always, you can find me on Facebook at Shelby Forsythia Intuitive Grief Guide, Instagram at Grief Guide Shelby Forsythia, or simply shelbyforsythia.com. If you'd like to leave a question or a comment for a future show or suggest a guest, leave a voicemail or text 312-725-3043 or email me at shelby@shelbyforsythia.com, subject line podcast. As always, it was beautiful sharing this space and time with you today. I see you, I am proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world, and I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing.